guys, let's see the newly introduced feature of JBoss, the domain mode. This was introduced in JBoss 7. Till now, JBoss was more like a standalone instances, or even though those instances can provide all the services that a group could provide, something like another app server like WebLogic or WebSphere, but managing of those instances used to get difficult as the size or the number of instances grow. So the JBoss guys have actually incorporated to make it easy to manage a group of instances. That group of instances is called a domain. Now the same group of instances in WebLogic is also called a domain, whereas in WebSphere it's called a cell. Now the concept is pretty same, just like any other app server. You have usually in a box, within a box basically, you have either one server or you have multiple servers. Now these multiple servers together, you can call it anything you want. Now in JBoss or WebLogic, it's called a domain, and if it is WebSphere, you call it a cell. In JBoss, it's a domain. It's called now from 7x onwards. This is a newly introduced feature in 7x. Till 7x, we don't have any such thing. All are called standalone machines. In WebLogic, we have a domain for a long time, whereas in WebSphere, or very popular one, WAS, you have it called a cell. Alright, now we're going to see how to actually create such a domain in JBoss. Even before we get into that, we will see the structure of a JBoss domain, the architecture. So let's go ahead and let's concentrate all that. Okay. Now you can see up here, before we go in further, a couple of things we're going to discuss about. Just the basic introduction of why a domain is introduced in the first place, or how it's useful for the general administration. And to put it in other words, what's the difference between a standalone JBoss server versus a domain mode JBoss server, which means there are a group of servers that are together to form a domain. Then we will see the general architecture of domain mode. This is very important. We will see what are the various processes, their purposes, and what are the resources consumption and other stuff, and the relationship among all those things. Then we'll also see quickly how to start and stop the servers in a domain mode. We already know how to start and stop the servers in a standalone mode. We have used standalone.sh script, and we have also created a wrapper script to do that. But in a domain mode, there are similar scripts available. We will see what is that script to start the servers in the domain mode. Then exclusive to domain mode, you have something called servo groups. So when there are multiple servers involved, obviously there should be some mechanism to group those things. So this is the new concept, again available only in domain mode. It's called servo groups. So we will see what are servo groups, why a servo group gets used, how JBoss takes advantage of such servo groups. Then we will see how to extend your domain into multiple boxes. That's probably a very common thing that needs to be done, because any app server, we don't imagine that all this JVMs are in a single box. That's never possible. So any architecture should allow us to extend the group or the domain to multiple boxes. So we have the same setup in WebLogic. The domain can be extended across boxes. The web sphere, the cell can be extended over the boxes. And in JBoss also, the domain can be extended across multiple boxes. Now the groups of the servers that form the server groups can also be extended across the boxes. We'll talk about more of it. Then we'll do a comparison of the scalability of JBoss domain, means how it compares against a WebLogic domain or a WebSphere cell. We will see whether JBoss domain is better or not so better than a comparative app servers in the market. What? So let's go ahead and see. Now the first introduction is again domain mode introduced in only 7, so you don't have any domain mode kind of thing before 7. They're all standalone machines. The domain mode basically gives a centralized control. So using some kind of tools like admin control tool that we have in WebLogic, or WebSphere also has a control. It's called integrated control environment or something. All of these tools will basically allow you to control multiple instances from a single centralized location. That especially makes administration of these app servers easy. You might have 10, 20, 30 JVMs, and for example, a simple thing like deployment is much easier if you can do it using console rather than having to do it across all the servers individually. So that's the kind of facility an admin console provides usually to the administrators. So the ease of administration is increased by having the centralized control. Then the last point here you will see JBoss domain. We did a comparative discussion of whether JBoss domain is better than a WebLogic or WebSphere domain. In fact, it is actually better than the other two competitors, but we will see why it's better. You will have understanding of why JBoss domain is much more flexible than a WebLogic domain once you understand the architecture of JBoss domain. It's pretty straightforward, but I want to get into the architecture and see why is so. Now this diagram gives you an overall view of how a domain looks like. Now if you see clearly, this has 2 boxes in it. Alright, this is box 1 on to the right side, and then you have box 2 to the left side. You might have any IPs you want. Now some of the major processes in a domain mode JBoss is these things. Now before we get into other process, let's see the actual instances. So you're seeing here the JBoss instance 1. This is the JVM of JBoss. This is another JVM of JBoss. Now these 2 JBoss JVMs are on box 1. Now the same way on box 2 also we have 2 JVMs. These are usually called JBoss servers or JBoss instances, anything we can call them. So they're basically JVMs. So on the second box also we have 2.1 and 2.2. So there are 2 on box 1 and 2 on box 2. On box 1 we are calling them 1.1 and 1.2, and on box 2 we are calling them 2.1, 2.2. Now these instances, if you see, each one of them is grouped into a servo group. Now this is just a logical grouping of the servers. So we might have these 2 JBoss servers into one group. Now the reason for creating such a group is to basically have them provide similar kind of services. Now JBoss is very what we say, efficient at optimizing the startup times and optimizing the service startup, especially in terms of if you see in JBoss, you have what are called profiles. Now, there are default profiles that we have usually. The standalone art profile, or what you have is the full profile, HA profile, then default profile, those stuff. So now those profiles are nothing but a group of services. Now in your project you may want only certain services. Now you can create your own profile. The JBoss allows you to create custom profiles also. It's possible, but most of the times the default 4 profiles are sufficient. We don't have to really customize too much on those profiles front, but the 4 things are sufficient. Now the server group, basically here if you see, the server group makes these 2 servers have a single profile. Yes, we can assign profiles at server group level. Now, so server group, this group may have, I think the number here is wrong, it's supposed to be 1. So this group may have, let's say, a default profile, whereas this group can have HA profile, which means the clustering services are offered by these 2 instances, whereas clustering services are not offered by these 2 services because it's in default profile, whereas this one can offer, or these 2 servers can offer clustering services because they're getting the HA profile. So even though both these boxes are, all these 4 instances are in a single domain, still each one of them is capable of offering a different set of services. Now, apart from these 2 processes, let's look at some of the important processes. Now, on box 1, you have a process controller, something called a process controller. Then there is something called a host controller. Now, these 2 obviously are the most important process of a domain. Now, the host controller controls the JBoss instances, whereas a process controller actually takes care of starting and stopping these instances. Host controller controls the propagation of deployments, other configuration related things. Now the same structure means process controller, host controller, instance. The same 3 processes are almost available everywhere. Means if you go to box 2, you see a similar structure. There is a process controller, there is a host controller, then there are instances. The host controller actually takes care of propagating the deployments and the configuration changes. The process controller takes care of starting and stopping the servers. Again, the server group is just a logical one. You don't see any process. Means if you do a ps-ef grep for Java, you will see in this case 4 processes. The first one is going to be the process controller, then the second one is going to be the host controller, the third and fourth ones are going to be your actual JVM instances. These are the physical processes that exist on your system. Now normally what happens is when you are creating a domain, box 1 has all the same 4 processes, or 4 box 2 also has same 4 processes. Here actually process controller, host controller and instance, there are actually 3, but because we have 2 instances, so it forms 4. So here if you say the second host controller, means on the second box, the host controller actually connects to the first box host controller here. Now in this case, the first box host controller allows everything about this domain to be controlled from here. For that reason, this host controller is also called a domain controller, which means this host controller controls the entire domain. So in any JBoss domain, whatever number of boxes you have, each box will have its own process controller and host controllers, and then the instances. But one of these host controllers is also called a domain controller, which means all remaining host controllers will connect with the first host controller, which is actually called a domain controller. All right, so we will be accessing our console application or JBoss CLI application from the domain controller. So from here we'll be accessing everything. So whether it's a web console or it can be the CLI, whatever it is, we'll be connecting to the domain controller to actually do this one. So the CLI is actually running on double line. We already know this, and the web console, if you want to use it, is running on triple line 0. The default port numbers. If you have changed it, you have to use this. So that gives a centralized control of your domain. Then to start and stop the domain mode, we quickly can use the domain.sh command. So let's go ahead quickly and try to start the servers. Okay, let's go ahead and create a directory, JBoss ITP 101. So I have just now created a directory. I'm going to go ahead and install JBoss into it. So let's go ahead and copy the files from it. So JBoss install files, copy our installation. This is the installation file into the directory just now that we have created. It's going to be home and code IT students JBoss ITP 101. So copy it out there. Right, now let's go ahead and unzip it. So that will form your installation. So this is JBoss EAP 6.2. I want to remove the original zip file. If at all required, we'll copy it again just to save some space. I'm going to create a link to this one to make it easy for access always. So let's call it JB1. So this is JB1, and this is going to be my JBoss home. So get into JBoss home. Let's go ahead and start the servers in domain mode. So let's see if some process is already running. And nothing is running at this point. So let's go ahead and start the server. Now to start the server, get into bin directory. Just like standalone.sh, you'll also see domain.sh. The domain.sh command will actually start all the servers in that domain. So if you see in here, it not just one thing, it will start the process controller, it will start the host controller, and it will start any servers that might be in the host.xml file. We will see what are the contents of the host.xml file in a moment, but let's see what are the default servers that come up when we start a domain. So let's go ahead and create and execute domain.sh command. Now if you observe it slightly, the domain mode, the number of processes started is more than what you will see in a standalone startup. Here if you see, there are almost 147 services started out of 209. I think whereas in standalone you will see somewhere around 49 or 50 services started. So the domain mode, the services itself are more. Apart from that, it starts a lot of other kind of services. You can actually see some of them by going through just the log file, but we're actually interested in how many processes were started after you executed the domain.sh script. So I'm going to go ahead and do a ps-ef grep for Java, see if all the process were started. Ideally it should start a process controller, a host controller, and some of the servers. Now let's see. I think it looks like there are 4 processes started. This is one. This is the first process, and it is the process controller. So the process controller is started. Now the process controller, process ID of C is 4428. Let's keep that in mind. Now the process controller actually started the host controller, which is the second one. We see this one, the process ID is this one. The 4428 actually started 4442. So the process controller is the one that starts the host controller. Now once these two are done, the next thing is server 1. Now the server 1 is also started by 4428. It's not the host controller that starts the servers, it's the process controller. I think the name itself tells you that this is the one who is controlling the process. So all the process technically should be controlled by the process controller, including the host controller process. So 4428 basically creates other process for 4428 here. So you have 2 servers here. One is server 1, this is the default name. Other one is server 2. So these are the 2 default servers that get started when you start domain.sh. Now these 2 servers are ideally defined in host.xml file. You should be able to see those 2 files in host.xml file. This is the default host configuration file. Now this file obviously is available under the configuration directory of domain. So let's get to that directory. So go to student, JBoss ITP 101, JB1 if you see, domain, now configuration. You see this host.xml file. The host.xml file usually has the list of servers, now usually at the end. Now this is the name of the master or the host itself. Usually the master, the box 1 is actually the master box. Now don't worry about all these things, go towards the end of this file. When you go towards the end of this file, you will see a tag called servers. And this servers actually defines what are the servers that are going to be started if host.xml is used as a configuration file. Now in this one, if you observe, there is a server 1 that belongs to main server group, and then there is a server 2 that also belongs to main server group. But the difference here is in terms of, you see this one, the auto start here. The auto start is true for server 2 and also for server 1. I think the server 1 auto restart is not defined anywhere. It just comes up. Whereas server 3, if you say, the auto start is not true, which means when we execute domain.sh, it's not going to come up. if we want the server 3 also to come up automatically, we have to change this from false to true. So let me just try that one. So I'm gonna do a host.xml. Let's take a backup before we actually mess it up. Host.xml .bqp vi host.xml. Go to the end of the file. A server 3, let's say we want to start this one also when we execute the domain.sh. So now to kill the process, the easiest thing to do to kill all this process is to kill the process manager itself. The moment you kill this one, everybody else gets killed automatically, or else you should kill each one of them independently. If you see, nothing is running on this box. Alright, now let's go ahead and start the entire domain. This time, because we have changed the auto start of server 3, even server 3 should come up. So I went into the bin directory. Let's execute domain.sh. But this time there should be 3 processes that actually come up. Clear the space, grab Java. Now if you see this one, server 3 is also up. The other 2 obviously will be up. Server 1 is up, server 2 is up, server 3, the new one, is up. Now this is up because we said auto start of this server is true, means this should be automatically started when we execute the domain.sh. Again, this is the host controller, this is the process controller. You kill the process controller, everything gets killed. Now that's your JBoss server in the domain mode. Now we have created this one. Let's quickly add a user and try to log into the console. Or even before that, let's go ahead and change the lesson address, lesson port. Now if you see this one, this server is actually listening on the local address 127.0.0.1, and we will not be able to access it from this box. So we want to change this 127.0.0.1 to the IP of this box, which is this. So if we can change the lesson address of our JBoss server to the IP address and stuff its loop back, we will be able to access the console by using this IP. So let's kill the process first. ps-grep for Java. Let's kill the process manager so that we can kill a process controller, so that we can kill everything else simply. So kill -9 the process controller. Killed. Now nothing should be running. Let's just check it out that nothing is running. Right, nothing is running. Now go ahead and add a user. So /add user to it. Now this is a management user, option A, because we'll be using this user to access the console and manage the domain. Enter the details of the new user. Let's call it encode IT. Password encode IT @123. Re-enter it, encode IT @123. What groups do you want this user? Nothing at this point, so just blank. About to add user ID, yes, just add it. Now, is this new user going to be created for one application server process to connect to another application server process? Now, for now, let's just use this user to log into the console, not necessarily to, connect between the process. So we are simply trying to log into the console. So for that one, just say, no, I'm not going to use this. Is this new user going to be used for one process to connect to another? No, we're not going to use for such thing. So your encode user is added and your servers are already running. Ideally, you should restart the servers after the changes, but sometimes it's not necessary. I'm going to go ahead and start the servers. Just in case if it is required. Oh, it's not running at all. That's good then. I'll go ahead and start the source. Now that we added the user, we should be able to log in. But yeah, I forgot to mention that we have to change the listener address also. So this one, they are listening on 127.0.0.1. That's something that's not what we wanted. We won't be able to ping from outside that box, or we won't be able to access the console from outside that box if it is listening on 127.0.0.1. So this is something that we want to change for all the port numbers. So let's go ahead and kill the process, Control C. So nothing is running. Now we want to start the server using a wrapper script this time. Let's call it start domain.sh. So let's call it JBoss home equal to home encode IT students JBoss ITP 101 slash JB1. That's your JBoss home. Then let's say $of JBoss home bin directory has a script called domain.sh that needs to be run. The output of that log should go to, now before we send output and everything, we want to bind the listener address, bind the regular addresses to the IP of this box, and bind the management, means the console and the CLI, also to the same port number. Then we are ready to send everything into the log files. Let's say domain.log to redirect it to address of 1, run everything in the background, add a no hub at the beginning. So we are ready to go. Now your server should start listening on 192 port number. Something is not correct. Okay, start domain.sh, sysmod 755, start domain.sh. Now you have the script. Now let's go ahead and run it. Now it creates a domain.log. It should show you that this process is coming up. And we have a wrapper script, which is pretty nice. So now you'll be able to start your service on a specific IP port. Now if you observe that IP port, let's see with one of those IP ports. Here we go. This is 8330, some port. The same way it will also be listening on 9990 and 9999 for, here we go. This is 9990, the web console that we are planning on accessing. Similarly, somewhere above or below, you will have the other port also. Now let's go ahead and access this thing. I think we should give the console thing. Oh yeah, it's still working. So go ahead and try to access your servers, the console of the domain. So we have created a user encode IT @123 is the password that we have given during that creation. And this is your console of a domain mode. Now there is one additional field. You will see hosts, because it's possible that in a domain mode you have multiple hosts. Now the same thing about there's only one host here, master. We can add multiple hosts. that we will see later. Runtime, if you see, I will see the overview of all the servers here. The tick mark basically tells you that the server is running, and then we have the remaining details. So here we have this master domain controller. Server 1 is running, server 2 is running, server 3 is running. You can make some changes here also, like stopping, starting. And then we also see the different groups. Here if you say, the most important, the reason why we can have server groups is this group has a profile full, whereas this group has a profile HA. You can actually change these profiles if you want. That can be done in your profiles configuration. All right. Here we can set up our profiles for individual servers. Now that this is a full profile, obviously you're going to have all the details of full profile. Apart from that, we can actually configure infinite span and their caches. We'll talk about these different types of cache and how they are used when you're using infinite span clustering. Apart from that, messaging, this is usually discussed when we have Hornet queue discussion. And then security, not much to discuss here in the security, and then the other areas. So each profile has its own set of configuration parameters. Then this is server groups. So you have main group, other group, and main group, and it will also tell you what each server falls under. And this is a runtime that we already know about. This tells you the data sources. If you want to create a data source, you should ideally go into profiles and then create a data source related to your database. So that's your domain mode. Startup and shutdown is just by killing the process controller, or you can individually kill all of them. Now that you have accessed the console, the same thing can be done using a command prompt also, especially using JBoss CLI.sh controller equal to the IP port of the controller at 128.6.99.99. So this should ideally connect you to the controller. The first command is connect. Then you can do a lot of ls and get into each one of them and see what is actually deployed and what is not. Right. So we'll talk about this thing in detail at another session, but for now, domain mode, startup, shutdown are pretty simple as a regular startup shutdown. The good thing about domain mode startup is you can set up all the servers that needs to be started in a file, something like host.xml file, and then simply run domain.sh script to start all those processes. That's pretty cool. All right. Now this domain, if you see, we have started the servers only in one box. We did not see how they should be extended into a second box. We will see that extension into a second box in another video or something, but once it is extended, it's basically a single unit of servers and all of them can be controlled from a centralized controller. Then we have seen the domain.sh, and we have also seen a little advanced version of this one by using -b and -b management. Those two commands especially help you bind this management port and regular ports. If you see this command, this is a wrapper script that we have used very nicely to start the process in the background and especially to capture all the logs and everything. So these are the two additional new settings, that new command line parameters that we used to actually start the domain. Now, as we discussed about, all the servers are defined in the host.xml file. Now that is the default file, and we can also change that file to anything we want. So we'll be using another file in another session, just when we try to discuss how a domain should be extended to another box. Whereas at this point of time, we have a domain only on one box. And this has 3 servers. All the 3 servers have enabled auto start. It's not auto restart, it's auto start. So it means that when you execute domain.sh, all the 3 servers will get started at it. Alright, so that's your domain mode. I think a couple of points about the server groups now. Now, server group is obviously a logical group, which means it's not necessary that, unlike this, see here, if you see this diagram, we mentioned that server group is comprising of only these 2 servers. This is more of a convenience. It's not mandatory that all server group members should be in the same box. It's perfectly fine if you are actually creating a server group of 2 servers from different boxes, something like this. You can call it a different server group. Alright, so it's perfectly fine for a server group to span across the boxes. It's not mandatory that it should be within that box. So that's one point really important. Apart from that, each server group in the domain can have a different profile. Just now we have seen it here. If you see the host, not the host, runtime, get into runtime overview. If you see this one, this is a main server group, this is one server group, and this is the other server group. These are the 2 server groups that will come by default, and you have, for the main server group, the profile is full, and for the other server group, the profile is full HE. And this is the advantage of having a domain mode. So apart from the centralized control, it's also possible that servers can have different profiles, and all of them can be managed from a single point of control, like a console on the domain controller. Then extending a domain to multiple boxes. This activity we will see in another session. So we can extend it, the domain, or we can add servers in a different box, and those servers will still be part of the first box. Therefore, they can be controlled from the first box console or first box CLI. Then the scalability of JBoss domain means it's something like, how many servers we can add to a JBoss domain. That's what we are actually talking about, the scalability. Now, if you say this is one box, you might have a couple of servers, JVMs here. Now, the moment the box is occupied, or the moment, let's say, we have enough load on the box, you may want to buy another box, add a couple of servers to it. At the same time, you don't want the overall complexity of administering these JVMs would increase, which means, let's say if there is a domain controller here, if this is a process controller, so if this is a process controller, this is also a process controller, then this is a host controller. So this host controller is expected to contact the host controller on box 1. So here you have host controller, here you have host controller, but on box 2, this assume is box 2, this, let's say, is box 1. So the host controller on box 2 is supposed to contact the host controller of box 1, but because this being the most what we say, the controlling one, this is actually called a domain controller in this scenario. Right. Now the scalability is, if you observe this one, the JVMs of this box 2 are in no way dependent on anything of box 1, which means box 2 JVMs, this JBoss 2.1 and let's say JBoss 2.2, we are calling it JBoss 2.1.2.2, but actually if you see, just now that we have started, they are called server 1, server 2, like that, server 1, server 2. But this is not a very good practice of setting up your servers. You set up using proper naming convention. so that it's easy to manage. So let's call them JBoss 21221112. Now if you see these things, these servers are in no way dependent for any resource on box 1, which means they're very unlikely that they're going to need anything from box 1, except when there is a deployment which will be actually propagated to the servers by the host controller, but not directly. So even if you add another box now and add a couple of servers to it, none of the existing process get burdened by the addition of these two processes, which means the performance of any of these things is not going to be affected at all. The new box again is going to have its own host controller, and it's going to have its own process controller. Now if you see the structure, it's so efficient that now you can actually increase it to hundreds of instances, hundreds of boxes. Still nothing actually is basically impacted too much. Now if it is too many servers and all of them trying to access the domain controller here, you may slightly see a problem on the domain controller, but otherwise it's pretty okay even to scale your domain to about 50-60 JVMs, and still you won't see any impact, considerable impact at all. So JBoss instances in terms of scalability offer more opportunities, means they are better than the popular two like WebLogic, WebSphere. JBoss cluster or JBoss domain is much better. It has capacity to actually expand into a bigger size compared to other two. Right. So that's the domain mode. We are not talking anything about clustering here. So domain mode does not mean a cluster. That's one thing that we have to remember. But clustering can be done in any kind of mode. You can have a cluster on standalone mode. You can have a cluster on domain mode. A cluster requires two servers. That's it. It doesn't matter where those two servers are, which type of architecture it is. The servers can be on same box or different box. The servers can be from standalone architecture versus domain architecture. So we'll be talking about clustering in detail in a later session. But for now, we have just now talked about a domain and its structure. We also are going to have another session on extending that domain also to a second box. Alright, so see you on the next video.